This is years ago. My wife and I were still living in Wilmington after we had graduated from UCW. We helped plant a church down there, and I was finishing my master's degree, working part-time at the church, and then as I was finishing my seminary degree, I needed to get a full-time job. And the church was kind of the smaller church, they couldn't afford to pay me full-time. So we were, looking around places, applying all these places, and it took a really hard time. It took me like months to find like a normal working job. And I think part of the problem was my undergrad degree was in religious studies. My master's degree in religious studies, and my biggest work experience was at a church. And so the average employer was like, you have like no real skills. That's what they thought. And so it took a while, and I remember I interviewed for this Verizon store in Wilmington, and you go through like 3 or 4 interviews. I went through the last one, and they didn't hire me or say no. And so I was like really frustrated because there was this other store that wanted to interview me, but they couldn't until the first store said like yes or no. And I remember we had this like dinner thing, hanging out with some people from the church one night, and I was explaining my frustrations. And I was like, yeah, this guy that I interviewed with at Verizon, like he didn't really know what he was talking about. He was asking me questions, and it just seemed like he wasn't altogether there. And it was going on and on. And the guy in his 40s looks at me after he hears me like 4 minutes like bash on this guy who interviewed me. He goes, I think I know the problem. And as Taylor Swift said, it was me. I was just like kind of arrogant, kind of prideful, kind of came across as like I knew better than the people working there. And I was like, man, I thought I deserved this, and he didn't seem, like he knew what he was doing. And, I was really just like opposite of humble and trying to find a job. And I share that because today we're going to look at this question of what happens when we seek God with humility. And I know this, like as followers of Jesus, people who are maybe interested in the things of Jesus, you might know like intellectually, obviously when I approach the Lord, I should be humble and I shouldn't be arrogant, and I shouldn't demand things. At least that's what we think. However, what we're going to see today as we read this story is what we think is supposed to happen versus what we actually do might actually not be the same thing. So the question is, how can we actually approach the Lord with humility in a way that he will actually respond to us? And so if you have a Bible, we will be in Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. If you don't have a Bible, again, we have those black ones in the hallway on the tables in the back, and you can take one of those home if you do not own one. And in those black Bibles, we'll be on page 894. Now, I want to give us some context before we read this story of Jesus today. As you know, you can, in the Gospels, for example, read the stories on their own and still learn some things and take some things from them. However, if you better understand the context of what's going on in the Gospels and why the Gospel authors include these stories and the order in which they include them, it actually sheds a lot more light on what we're supposed to learn from the story. So, before we get to Mark chapter 7, verse 21, you have 23 verses in the chapter of Mark 7 before we get to the story. And Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 23 is a story about some Pharisees and scribes, so some religious leaders. They're confronting Jesus and his disciples about not following Jewish purity rituals of how to wash hands before a meal. And this isn't just like a hygiene thing. It's also like you got to be ritually clean and pure, and they're not doing the things that are right. And so they get confronted. Now, I do want to say this. There are a couple times in the Gospels where Jesus gets confronted by religious leaders for not kind of maybe following the law in the way in which they interpreted it. It is important to know this. Jesus and his disciples actually never violate the Old Testament laws, but what they do on occasion is they don't follow the traditions that had been developed over time. So what happened, and I would say this with really good intention, is that you have the laws of the Old Testament that you're not supposed to violate. And so over time, you would have like these barrier or these buffers that these religious leaders would kind of install to say, in order for us not to break the law, here's kind of the guardrail that we're going to not also break, because if we break the guardrail, at least we haven't sinned yet. So over time, what happened is these extra buffers and guardrails also like in essence became like law. That even if you broke like the guardrail or the buffer and not actually the law itself, they could get pretty upset with you and you could be viewed as guilty of breaking the law. So Jesus at times, he violates what are the buffer, kind of the man-made traditions with good intentions, but he doesn't actually violate the law. So in Mark chapter 7, that's what he and his disciples do, or really his disciples do. And so he goes on to say this. After he gets accused of this, he then tells the religious leaders that what defiles a person is not external. So it's not food or rituals. That's not what makes someone unclean, but what comes from the heart. Ultimately, what comes from the heart is what makes somebody unclean. Then he declares all food clean, which is a very radical concept because he's saying, hey, even the kosher food laws, which were good for the Israelites, all food is actually clean. And the religious leaders are like, who are you? Like, who are you to have the authority to kind of like maybe give us a software update, if you will, kind of update what it looks like to honor? Like, who are you? Who gives you the authority? And so I just want to say this. Right before the story we get today, Jesus has just taught that purity is not about external rules. And then he goes into a Gentile area, which is a place that Jews would consider full of unclean people. So he says our heart posture is what really makes us clean. And then he goes into an unclean area because Mark wants to show us something. So Mark chapter 7, verse 24, he goes into this Gentile area and it says this. He, that is Jesus, got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. So again, Jesus is leaving the Jewish region of Galilee. He travels to Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon, which was a kind of northwest from where he was in Galilee. And the player he was, in Tyre where he was, has a long history of antagonism towards Israel. So for us, it's just helpful to know, it's not that Jesus is just going to a Gentile area, but he's going to a Gentile area that's like, as a Jewish reader, it's like, why would you go there? Like, there's a lot of places you could go, a lot of Gentile places you go. Why would you go there? It would be like a bunch of Duke fans like going to Chapel Hill bar to watch a Duke game. Like, that would just be like weird. Like, you don't have to go to Durham to watch a Duke game, but like going to Chapel Hill would be weird. Or maybe this. It's kind of like a bunch of vegetarians who go to Outback because Outback has really good salads. Like, that would just be weird. Now, I don't know if Outback has good salads or not, because, I don't get them when I go to Outback. I go there to get what you're supposed to get, which is steak. And so, but I don't know. So maybe they are. It's like maybe there's a couple of vegetarians, they just love the salad at Outback. Like, that would just be kind of odd. Like, there's a lot of places you could get a salad. I don't know why you would go to Outback. So as a Jewish reader, that's what you're thinking. Like, why would you go to Tyre? Now, we are not told Jesus' motive for going where he was going. Perhaps it had to do, at least in some degree, because of the opposition from the Pharisees and from Herod, the kind of the governor of the area. So in Mark, up to this point, he's had a lot of opposition. And we're not told why he entered a house and desired secrecy. Perhaps it was to spend time with his disciples without the crowds to try to teach them. But however, he gets found out. And for whatever his reasons were for trying to keep it secret, he gets found out, and this happens, verse 25. Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking Jesus, to cast the demon out of her daughter. So again, you've just got this story that Jesus says it's not external, but internal that makes you clean or unclean. Then he has this Gentile woman who comes to help Jesus, begs Jesus to cleanse her unclean daughter from the demon that she has. Now, again, Mark, just some history here to help us understand. Mark tells us that this woman is a Syrophoenician woman. Now, this was a modern Roman term in the first century to describe the area that she was from. Mark's audience would immediately know what type of person this would be and where she was from. She's a Syrophoenician, kind of in this area. She's a Gentile. She's not a Jew. Now, interestingly, the Gospel of Matthew, so Matthew also includes this story in his Gospel, and he gives us a couple of extra details that really fill out what's going on here. In Matthew's account of the story, which again, the Gospel of Matthew was written to a primarily Jewish Christian audience, so people that would have been really familiar with the Jewish laws, customs, tradition, and history. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew tells his audience that she was a Canaanite, which is the name of the area that she came from in the Old Testament. So it's not a modern area of Rome, but in the ancient world where she was from, that was referred to as Canaan, which again makes a Jewish reader feel the weight of who she was, that she is an outsider. She's not just a Gentile, but she's from the very people that God originally told Israel to drive out from the land. So when it comes to Gentiles, unclean people, she's not only from like a bad area, she's like the worst of the worst, from a Gentile audience. So in this story, you have this outsider begging a Jewish Messiah for help. And then on top of that, in Matthew's telling of the story, we are also told that she says to Jesus, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." So in part of her initial ask, she says, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." Again, in Mark's Gospel, which is a Roman audience, that detail is not very significant. But in Matthew's Gospel, written to Jews, what you see is this unclean, bad, Gentile woman appearing to claim in some way that Jesus is the Messiah. That even though she might not fully know all the Old Testament stories and all that sort of thing, that we do know that the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of David, and you have this Gentile unclean woman claiming that Jesus is from the line of David. And so I just want to say this. What you have here is a woman whose resume is not someone you would expect Jesus to help. Again, this is a little hard for us because, we've read the Gospels, you know the story, you kind of know well, Jesus is supposed to help and love everybody. But in this ancient concept, Jesus, again, is a Jewish Messiah. This is not someone you would expect a Jewish Messiah to help. And again, of all the people who come in the Gospel of Mark, who come to Jesus, she actually has the most against her from a Jewish perspective. Again, she is a woman approaching a man. She is a Gentile. She's from one of the worst places historically for the Israelites. Again, you would feel emotionally charged as a Jewish person reading this. And you would think in no way would a Jewish Messiah want to help her. Again, without us growing up in this context, it's a little bit hard for us to emotionally understand or to put ourselves in the place of how they would have read this. And so I want to maybe give some modern examples to kind of show the shock here. Maybe you can think of it this way. Imagine maybe a Ukrainian soldier going out of their way to show compassion to a Russian prisoner of war. So you have the Russians, they're invading your land. They've likely killed a lot of your friends in the Ukrainian army. You capture a bunch of them. And this Ukrainian soldier, you're going out of your way to make sure they're cared for. You would kind of think well, yeah, you're supposed to love people, but I don't know about you should love that person. Maybe like a Jewish rabbi in Israel deciding to help someone from Hamas. So not just maybe the Israel-Palestine conflict, but someone who's actually part of the terrorist organization of Hamas who invaded your land, slaughtered a bunch of your people. Imagine a Jewish rabbi going out of their way to make sure a Hamas person was cared for. Or maybe a Christian in North Korea who was secretly giving food and shelter to a former government official who was responsible for detaining Christians and maybe even having Christians killed. You would think, of course, we should care for people. And maybe we know intellectually it's not true, but how we feel, I think all of us might say, at least emotionally, you might feel well, certainly there's at least some limit to how much we should go out of our way to help someone. Maybe the average person, fine. But from maybe the evil person or the person who's really wronged us, you would feel some sort of way if you saw that. And so this is what they would have felt reading the story. Now, I want to say this as well. In Matthew's gospel, we are told that Jesus does not say anything right away. So she comes up, says, I have an unclean spirit, asks that Jesus would heal her daughter. But before Jesus replies, Matthew gives us an extra detail. So Matthew chapter 15, verse 23, it'll be on the screen, it says this. She asked for help. Jesus did not say a word to her. His disciples approached him and urged him, send her away because she's crying out after us. So initially, Jesus doesn't respond right away. The disciples want Jesus to send her away. Again, a Gentile woman shouting after a Jewish rabbi would be kind of not just embarrassing, but also just culturally really improper. It's also a violation of cultural norms, and she's making a scene on top of it. And because of who she is, the disciples are like, man, you should get her out of here. And I want to say, again, we might think, well, you shouldn't do that, but I just want to say, we can do the same thing. We can do the same thing. There are people, maybe if you're really honest, who really hurt you or wounded you, who you also would say, I don't know that you deserve a place at the Lord's table. Or maybe someone who is too far gone. I think it's just helpful for us to think, is there someone in your life who has really wounded you or stabbed you in the back or done something wrong? Man, if you could, even if you know it's not right, you wouldn't mind, if God didn't save them. Or if you're honest, you might feel some sort of way if they walked into New City Church one Sunday morning and were worshiping with their hands held high and they came up front. Is there anyone in your life you'd I guess that's great for you, but you feel some sort of way about it. But that's what's going on here. And so the disciples are like, Jesus, tell her to leave. And then Jesus says this, verse 24, he replied, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Again, I just want to say, you might assume, well, Jesus is supposed to say that. Of course, he's just supposed to help her. But that's not what he does. He says to her, he eventually responds, I was only sent to the lost house, the sheep of the lost house of Israel. What's going on here is that Jesus' earthly ministry was directed towards Israel first. And then it was directed towards the nations. At this point in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been focusing exclusively on Israel. He's trying to teach Israel that I am the promised Messiah, the one that God foretold about, the one that the prophets talked about. I'm the one fulfilling the law who is coming for you. Now, as we know, it doesn't mean that the Gentiles are excluded, but we do know in the Gospels that God's plan through Jesus is unfolding in stages. And so initially, here's what he does. He declines her response, her request. He kind of says, no, I was only sent to the last sheep of Israel. I guess he doesn't flat out say no, but you would assume well, obviously he's not going to do it. Verse 25, but she came and knelt before him. So she asks a second time and said, Lord, help me. Lord, help me. And so I just want to point this out. Initially, there was no response from Jesus, but she's given silence and rebuke from the disciples. And then she's kind of without being told no, she's kind of told no by Jesus, or at least Jesus responds in a way that you might think he's not supposed to. And then you would think, well, otherwise, if he's going to say yes, he would have just said yes. So he ignores her, or he doesn't ignore her, but he doesn't say anything. The disciples say, get out of here. Then he says, hey, actually, I came for Israel, and you're not part of Israel. So you might think, well, then that's it. Because if he's going to do it, he's going to do it. And I think if we're honest, this is how we can often operate toward God. We can often assume, well, God, I asked you for this thing, and it didn't happen, and so you must not care or must not be willing to make it happen. And so, why keep asking? I mean, this is the human response. So, God, I've asked you for this thing. I maybe told a few friends about it. We prayed for it a little bit, and nothing happens. And because you're all-powerful and can do whatever you want, you would have answered it by now, so I guess we should just stop asking. Now, I'm not going to recap it all here, but if you were here for us a few weeks ago for week 2 of our series, The People After God, we looked at the story of King Josiah. And in the story of King Josiah, we walked through multiple Old Testament examples where it is clear when you read the stories that God is asking someone to ask for mercy, grace, forgiveness, whatever the thing they were asking for. He was actually inviting them to continue to ask for it and to really ask for it and to not give up. There's many stories in the Old Testament that show us, no. What happens if the person would have kept asking? And so an astute Bible reader, if you're kind of familiar with some of these stories, knows that God invites us to really come to him. Not just once or twice, or not just in the moment we're feeling it, but to repeatedly come to him, to repeatedly keep seeking, and to not give up. So in the Old Testament, you have a number of stories of that, where we're supposed to read the stories and think, well, what if they had kept asking? And of course, in the New Testament, you have the explicit command to keep asking. I'm going to read a couple of these really quickly. You know the drill. The word that is in green, I'm going to ask you to say it out loud with me because I want us to see something. Matthew chapter 7, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and then to the one who knocks the door will be opened. In Luke 18, Jesus says this, now he told them a parable on the need for them to pray always and not give up. And then he goes on to tell the story of the persistent widow and the judge who would not stop asking, and eventually the judge grants her request because she kept asking. Romans 12, the Apostle Paul writes this, rejoice in hope, be patient in affliction, be persistent in prayer. Philippians 4, don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Oh, wait, there's more. Colossians chapter 4, it's the first word. So are you ready? Here's what it says. Devote yourselves to prayer. Stay alert in thanksgiving. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it says this. Pray constantly. Constantly. Not every once in a while, not just when you feel like it, constantly. We'll give you one more. James chapter 5, James says this, therefore, confess to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful in its effect. And then he's referencing a story in the Old Testament of the great prophet Elijah. He says this, Elijah was a human being as we are, and he prayed earnestly. And if you know the story of Elijah, he's got what it seems like a direct connection to the Lord. But he still prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the land. Then he prayed again, and the sky gave rain, and the land produced its fruit. Here's what we're seeing from the woman in the story, and here is the teaching from both the Old Testament implicitly and the New Testament explicitly. Here it is. Here's the point. Don't stop asking. Don't stop asking. That is what we see here. Listen, a non-response is not a final response necessarily. A non-response does not mean it is a final response. Now, I do want to say this. This encouragement, this principle that we're told to keep asking God is not a command. It is not a command to keep asking. I really just want to let you know, this is an option. So there are times where maybe you've prayed for a long time and maybe the thing has already happened, and maybe what you wanted to happen didn't happen. It's final. There can be times where it can just be painful to continually pray for a thing. So I'm not saying like, hey man, keep praying and it'll happen the way, I'm not saying that. But I am saying, I think for most of us, we're kind of tend toward the other side where we just kind of give up. There is the option in Scripture to keep asking the Lord, to keep going before the Lord. Now, of course, it is hard. One of the things that is hard about this is we don't know what God's going to do. And just because we might persistently ask doesn't mean what we want to have happen will happen. In fact, the thing that we might persistently ask about may never well come to be. But here's what we cannot do. What we cannot do is assume that we know what God is going to do simply because it has not happened yet. You cannot do that. You and I cannot assume that we know what God's going to do simply because it has not happened yet. And the Old Testament example we get, and the New Testament teaching we get, is keep asking. Keep asking. So let me give you like just a real personal example from my and Christina's life, like right now. Many of you know, for the last handful of years, we've been foster parents, so we have two kids of our own, and we've been fostering, and really our desire is to adopt a child. And it's not, I want to say, like when I'm having conversations with people, it's not just that we want to adopt another kid. What we really want to do is to provide a permanent home to a kid who needs a permanent home, because there are so many kids that need a permanent home. We've had 5 placements over the last 2.5 years, none of which have lasted longer than 3 months, and so it has been a lot. Like, it's just really hard to like open up your home for a few months, try to get in some sort of rhythm and trying to teach them what you're doing in your house and all of the disruptive stuff that the beginning of a placement that comes with it, and all the appointments Christina has to go to and all the meetings we have to have. And it's a lot of work. And, you know, if the kid's going to stay with you for a while, or certainly if you're going to eventually adopt them, it's totally worth it. But when they keep coming and going out of your home, like, it's really, really hard. And so, you know, a couple months ago, we said yes to what was a pre-adoptive placement of a 10-month-old girl. 3 weeks later, she got sent with a family member or an uncle. And so we're sitting here and it's like, man, we can't keep doing this. Like, it's just hard to continue to open up your home and to do all the things and to have them leave. Like, it's just really, really hard. And so we're kind of at a point now where it's like, do we keep doing this? Like, it kind of seems futile. And so we're here. It's like right now in our foster care journey, it appears that what we wanted and what we prayed for and what we think is a really good thing, and because there are so many kids who need a home, like, why have we not gotten that? Like, why have we not been placed with a child who needs a home, especially because, like, we're followers of Jesus. They're going to have siblings. They're going to have a mom and a dad who cares for them and a healthy environment, and we can provide for all their needs. It feels like right now that desire will never happen. That's what it feels like, if we're being honest. And so it's hard, a little bit frustrating, if I can be honest with you, for me to pray for this. And so honestly, my prayers right now is like, I don't even know if I want to do this anymore, Lord, but we're hoping to, and I don't even know how this is going to happen, because when you take a foster placement, it's never a guarantee. And it's like, we just can't keep doing this. We don't want to keep doing this. And so right now, it feels like that will never happen. But the teaching we're supposed to see here is, listen, it might not ever, but at least for now, one of the things I think the Lord is inviting me into is to just keep asking, because you don't know. You don't know. So it can be hard, it can be painful, it can be disappointing, but the principle here is just because it has not happened, you can't say it won't, because you're not God. You're not God. So keep asking. Now, obviously, the woman in this story probably has very little, if any, context for the Old Testament stories, but where we read that, hey, you should keep pursuing the Lord. But she has a deep desire for her daughter, that Jesus would do something. She's obviously like heard stories about him, or else she wouldn't be there. And so she keeps asking, and she does not give up. And I think that this story is shared in 2 Gospels for a reason. So we're seeing the story for a reason. So she asks a second time, as we saw in Matthew's version, she actually asks twice. And here's how Jesus responds. So if you look back in Mark chapter 7, verse 27, after her second ask in total, it says this. He said to her, so after telling her essentially like, well, I'm here for Israel, and she says, well, Lord, you know, my daughter needs your help. He said to her, let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she replied to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. They eat his crumbs. Now, again, remember, Matthew has already showed us that this woman has persisted once. And then after the disciples told Jesus to send her away, and he responds to her eventually by saying, actually, I'm here for the house of Israel. Then she asks again. She says, Lord, help me. and help me. And then he gives her a little parable about, feeding the kids first. And then she like asks again, but even the dogs get crumbs at the table. Now, I just want to say this. This is probably not how you might think or you might assume Jesus is supposed to respond. Because she's asked a second time, and he still kind of says like, I'm sorry, but like, I'm not here for you. That's what it seems like. That's what it seems like. What he does here is he responds with a parable, which is a story. It's a one-sentence story that appears to be like an insult. At least it feels like an insult. Especially in an ancient culture where calling someone a dog was derogatory. Often, you didn't have like pets like you do now. Like some of y'all like go to like, premium chow for your dogs, like sourced from Asia, fresh, cut off the wild horse or wherever they comes from. It's like, they didn't have none of that. Like you had dogs and they were dirty and they were outside and maybe they protect your sheep or whatever, but they weren't like these loving, cuddly, like sleep in my bed. Like, that didn't happen. Okay, so that's what, like not a good thing. They scavenged, they're dirty, and for Jews, they were unclean because they were often doing stuff that would make them unclean. For Jewish people in the ancient world, they were unclean. The question is, what is happening here? Now, I want to say this. To be fair, Jesus does use a word for dog here, but the word he uses is essentially means puppy. It essentially means like a house pet. So it's not like he's not calling her a wild dog, but he's also saying it's like, hey, it's like kind of like a house pet type thing. Which I would say this, it would be significant for her because this is not what she would expect him to say. She would not be surprised for him as a Jew to refer to her as some sort of wild dog. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying is that we need to prioritize the kids first, which was Israel. But here's what you do know if you do have pets and maybe you let them sleep in your bedroom. I don't know. Usually you do know that you got to feed your pets. Even if you're like me and you've got 2 cats and maybe they're a little bit, replaceable every once in a while if they get lost or whatever. It's like I still feed them. Like I do have a heart, right? So I feed my pets, right? You got to feed your pets. So you would know it's like, well, maybe they have a priority, but like the pets still have to eat. Also, again, Jesus here, he reiterates that he came in a specific order. So first to the Jews to show that he is the fulfillment of all things. And then to the Gentiles to welcome them into God's family. His primary mission first is to the Jews, and after the resurrection, it is for the world to say, no, I am the Savior of the world. And so essentially, again, he is saying that there is an order to what I'm doing, and it is not yet your time. It is not yet your time. It's not that her time won't come, because again, he doesn't say like no to her, but he is saying like your time is not yet. It's not that I won't do it, but it's not yet. But again, man, like this is like, check this out. This is amazing. You might not think it's amazing. I think it's amazing, and you got to listen to me for the next couple minutes, so you hopefully think it's amazing. The Greek word here, that when it says, let the children be fed first. So check this out. The Greek word fed first comes from the Greek verb kortazo, which means, which is translated as fed first. What it literally means is to feed or to satisfy or to be filled. In other words, the family of Israel must be satisfied or filled first. Now, there are only 2 other instances in the Gospel of Mark, in all of the Gospels, where the word kortazo is used. The word kortazo is used. And would you guess that the only 2 other places is the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000? So again, this is amazing. Check this out. In Mark chapter 6, you get the famous story of the feeding of the 5,000. It is the only story that is in all 4 of the Gospels. And the feeding of the 5,000 is a primarily Jewish audience. So you get the fish and the loaves, and Jesus is essentially saying and teaching, like, I am the one who satisfies. I am the one who fulfills. So in Mark 6, you get Jesus fulfilling Israel, fulfilling the people of Israel. In Mark chapter 8 is when you get the feeding of the 4,000, and the feeding of the 4,000 is to a primarily Gentile audience. And in Mark chapter 7, you get the story bridging 6 and 8 together. So in Mark 7 bridges the feeding of the 5,000 Jews with the subsequent feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles, where he fulfills them all. And here's why this matters. I just think this is cool. Here's why this matters. Because when the dogs eat crumbs from the table, they do not rob children from their food. They simply eat what is theirs from the surplus of what the Father gives. This is what Mark is showing us. Jesus is not taking something from his children in order to satisfy and care for other people. Here's what happens. What Mark is trying to tell us is that at the Lord's table, there is always enough. There is always enough. There is always enough. It doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. Here's what happens. There is no, well, God, I know you did this thing for me in the past, So I'm not sure you'll be able to do this thing for me that I'm praying for now, because it's like, maybe you have like a limited supply of what you can do, and so maybe you've already used some of it, so maybe you don't have any more for me, or maybe you might think, well, God, I know you've done like this thing for me, or maybe this thing in the past in general, or I've seen you move in this way, so I'm not sure you'll be able to do this thing for me because you've done this in the past, and again, this idea of like maybe there's like a limited supply of what God can do, and what Mark is trying to show us is that Jesus is enough for all people. What we're going to see in a second is that Jesus is enough for all people. That even maybe the leftovers or the scraps are enough to satisfy you or fill you. That there's not a competition here between like his energy or what God can do for somebody and maybe not for you. I like to think of it this way. I've shared this story before. It's one of my favorite stories to share. My grandmother is still to this day like a really good cook and really hospitable and makes a lot of great food. And when me and my brothers were younger, we grew up in Cary, and my grandparents live in Statesville, so about 2 hours away. And so there are many times where like our whole family would go and spend some time with them. And there were also many times where either my mom or my dad would drive halfway and meet my grandmother, and she would, they'd drive about an hour each, and she would take us, and we'd spend some time with them, and then we'd do the swap on the way back. And my dad always loved her cooking. In fact, when he would go to her house, he would call it Fantasyland because the food was amazing and there was a lot of it. And, as a parent now, I get it. There were many times where my dad would say to my grandparents, especially my grandmother, that she's buying us toys or like serving us all these food, like doing all these things. He would say things to her like, that is not necessary. Like that's, you don't need to be doing that. You think that's not necessary. It's a lot, not necessary. And over time, she was like, Roger, like she's like, I'm going to do what I want to do. You can't tell me, it's going to be fun. And so one day, when she was going to meet my dad halfway to drop us back off, she told my dad that she was going to make him a pie. It's like one of our favorite stories to tell. She was going to make him a pie, and because he loved her pies. And so we met at a Cracker Barrel parking lot, and we get there, and we kind of unload our suitcase or whatever. We put it in my dad's car, and then my grandmother had his pie in the front seat, and she says, I'm going to go chew the pie. And so she hands him, the pie container, the silver container with like the white thing on top, I don't know. And so she hands it to him, and as she is handing him the pie container, she says to him, I didn't think it was necessary to fill it with a pie. That's amazing. That's amazing. Now, again, if you don't, like, it sounds like maybe like really like mean. It's like, it wasn't that mean, but it did get a point across. Like, they were fine. It's like, you keep saying it wasn't necessary. He's like, I want to do it. I'm not necessary. Now here's what I want to say. Her spending, now that, our kids have grandparents too, I find myself saying the same thing. Here's what she was doing for us. Here's what our grandparents do for their kids. Our grandparents do for kids. They're not like going into poverty to like care for their grandkids. Or they're not like taken away from their own food or their own, like they have enough. They love their grandkids. And so they want to spoil them a little bit. Like it's not a competition of resources for them. Not a competition of resources, because at the Lord's table, there's always enough. It is not taking away from what they have. And so again, because of that, here's her reply, verse 28. But she replied to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Now, she is told again in verse 27, it's not right to take the children's bread. And then she replies by saying, even the dogs have crumbs to eat. And in her response to that, Jesus says this, verse 29, then he told her, because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. When she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. The demon was gone. So here's what's happening here. The woman's response is stunning. So she doesn't give up after the first kind of like non-answer. She doesn't, maybe what we would do today, she doesn't like argue her rights as a human being, or she doesn't even say like Jesus is wrong, like you should do this. Maybe as a Gentile begging a Jew for help, she accepts that maybe, he's not going to maybe do what she says, but she still begs him on the basis of his goodness. She might be thinking like, well, if the rumors that I've heard are true, like I know you actually can do this. So she keeps asking. And what's even more ironic, here, check this out. She is the first person in the Gospel of Mark to understand and to respond to a parable of Jesus without having to be explained what he is saying. So every other time so far in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus teaches the crowd or the Pharisees or whatever, and then you have after the fact, Jesus explaining to his disciples what he actually meant by what he taught. In this story, you have a really quick parable of Jesus saying, I came to feed Israel first, and she responds without having to be explained what Jesus was saying. Now, here's what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying is that the children, according to Jesus, are Israel. They must be fed first. And the dogs, or household pets in this case, they will be fed, but not yet. And she astutely points out, that might be true, but that dogs don't have to wait for the crumbs, because they just especially if you got kids, you know this, they just happen right there. There's crumbs right there. And then Jesus is amazed at her response and does for her what she requests. In fact, in Matthew's account, he includes this: Jesus replied to her, "Woman, your faith is great. Let it be done for you as you want." And from that moment, her daughter was healed. So again, she gets it. In this story, she gets it even when the disciples often don't. That to her, she might get that the Jews, of course, are Jesus' primary or first mission. But if what I have heard about you is true, there is enough on your table that even your crumbs can satisfy. That even your extra, it is enough. And so what this story shows us, what this woman shows us, is this Syro-Phoenician woman, a Gentile, a Canaanite, a woman approaching a man, and a dog in Jewish slang. She embodies everything a religious Jew saw as defiled, unclean, and unworthy. She is the embodiment of defiled, unclean, and unworthy. She is someone who externally checks no boxes. However, she shows remarkable faith and humility. Remarkable faith and humility. And so the story demonstrates in real life what Jesus taught, that defilement and acceptance are about the heart. It's not about your ethnicity or your gender or even necessarily about the ritual law, which is what Jesus taught earlier in Mark 7. It's about your humility approaching the Lord. And of course, he's going to prove this in Mark chapter 8 when he feeds 4,000 Gentiles who were searching for him, and he satisfies them. And so what we see in this story is that there are no barriers God's grace cannot overcome. There are no barriers that God's grace cannot overcome. The good news of the gospel is no matter who you are or what you've done or what has been done to you, that anyone who confesses with their mouth that Jesus is Lord and believes in his heart that Jesus was raised from the dead, you can be saved. No matter your background, your history, all the ways you've got it wrong, your sins, your doubts, maybe ways that people have wronged you, there is no barriers. That is what Mark is trying to show us by this story in Mark 7. There is no barriers that anyone who has humility approaches the Lord in faith will get a response from God. Again, she doesn't argue with Jesus. She doesn't say, I deserve anything, but she does not stop asking. She doesn't stop asking. And if it is true that there are no barriers that grace cannot overcome, I just want to say to you, well, what does it look like to seek God in humility? And that means not, God, if you do this, I promise to do this in the future, or I'll be better in the future, or I'm sorry for what I did in the past. It's kind of like, I got nothing, I can add nothing to this equation. But will you do it? That instead of listing all the reasons why you think God should help you, what you should do is you should recognize that anytime he helps us, it is always out of his grace. It is always out of his grace. Again, we often think, well, if I do X or because I did X, then God should do the thing. And that is not how it works. That is not how it works. It makes me think of this way. I've shared this before. A couple years ago, we were at Chick-fil-A, and as we were leaving Chick-fil-A, I found a cell phone on the parking lot, upside down outside the parking lot. So I pick it up, and my first thought is, well, let me go bring it inside, and maybe the person can find the phone. And then I was like, but if the person lost their phone and they don't know they lost it at Chick-fil-A, then maybe they never come back to Chick-fil-A, or maybe they come back, but I don't know, if they put the phone somewhere, maybe the person at the cash register didn't know they had a phone, and they're probably never going to get it. So I decided to take it home, and I'll try to figure it out, and if I can't get into the phone, I'll drop it off at whatever carrier it is, and they can maybe call them. And so the phone was locked. It had a passcode. It was an iPhone, but it had the medical ID. So you can access the medical ID even if a phone is locked. And so I accessed the medical ID. It was a guy in his 50s or 60s, and I learned all of his medical ailments. But also his wife's contact was in the phone. And so I texted and I called her and said, hey, I found your husband's phone at this Chick-fil-A. Let me know. I'm happy to drop it off for you, whatever. Well, she eventually responds and she says, oh, that's my husband's phone. He's actually the owner-operator of that Chick-fil-A. And at which point your boy was like, oh yeah, I hit the jackpot. So the next day I was like, great, I'll bring it to him at Chick-fil-A next day. So the next day it was 12 or 12:30 because I went to the YMCA to exercise, workout, whatever, and I had my kids with me, so they were I don't know, 2 and 5. They were really little. It's like rush hour lunchtime. And I told them, I said, hey guys, I'm going to drop this phone off at Chick-fil-A. We are not going to get anything. And of course, I have to bring them in with me because, in today's day and age, if you leave your kids out in the car for 30 seconds, then you're arrested for the rest of your life, sent into like isolation in jail or something. So of course, I had to like bring them both with me. I'm like carrying them. I got this phone and it's like slammed in there. And I said, hey, this is the owner's phone. I talked to his wife. She's like, oh, thank you so much. I'll like let him know that you dropped it off here, whatever. So she takes it back and I just stand there for about, a minute or two, just in case, he wants to come out and say, hey, thanks so much. And by the way, here's a little gift card, a little something. He did a show. And so I'm like, well, whatever. He's got my contact. She's got my contact. She's a Chick-fil-A operator, obviously. I never heard from that joker again. Nothing. No sandwich, no milkshake. I'm like, bro, you're Chick-fil-A. You're supposed to do this. Now, if I had known he was going to do it, obviously, I still would have returned the phone. But I was kind of expecting, because I did this, well, maybe you should do this. And I was kind of disappointed that he didn't. Listen, that is not how God works. There is no, well, I'm going to do this, and so he owes me this. No. It is by grace. And that's good news. That's good news. Because right now, no matter who you are, you can approach him because there are no barriers because he satisfies. In other words, put it this way, here's how I would close. I think here's what maybe Mark's trying to show us. That a crumb from the Lord's table is more satisfying than a feast anywhere else. Just a crumb from the Lord's table can do more, can satisfy more, can fulfill more than anything, any amount of anything else. And what can be offensive about this story is that the woman's lack of standing up for herself, right? She doesn't argue her rights or whatever. She accepts her position of need. And in her humility, Jesus does what she asks. In her humility, out of the abundance of his grace, she gets from him what she cannot get from anywhere or anyone else. She gets from him what she cannot get from anywhere else, even just a crumb. That she did the courageous thing. She kept to be a people who continually seek the Lord in humility. Will we be a people who continually ask and seek and pray and not give up? Would we do that? A humble people following the Lord. And so if you're here this morning and you're trying to figure out this Jesus thing and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, the encouragement is today, not tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, after you prove yourself, today. There is no barriers to God's grace. You can repent of your sins and trust in Jesus, Lord. And if you're around, we'd love to do that after the sermon. We're going to have people down front. We'd love to pray for you. For those of us that are followers of Jesus, maybe you just need to be reminded, man, to seek him and to go and to pray and to ask and to not give up. Because just a crumb from the Lord's table is more satisfying than a feast anywhere else. Let's pray.
Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. We upload new videos every week to help encourage you in your faith in Jesus. So be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss a thing.